I am joined today by Malcolm Shayuna, who is a writer, and I am informed today that he is also a non-denominational populist living in Sweden, as well as Angela Nagle. She's the author of the book Kill All Normies, as well as a number of interesting essays in places like American Affairs, Unheard. And Angela, as we were just saying, you started off writing for Jacobin, but it's probably unlikely that we'll see your byline there anytime soon, which is sort of it's actually that's a kind of a good segue right into what we want to talk about. I should also add that both of you are regular collaborators on the What's Left podcast with Amy Therese and with Oliver Bateman. Malcolm, both you and Angela sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sort of grew up on the political left, but then were kicked out. Maybe, I don't know if you left them or they left you, but there was a split that occurred. Angela, you started writing at Jacobin, but that maybe it's useful to sort of frame this conversation, which is picking up where Malcolm and I left off a month or two ago about, it's almost like the title of your other podcast, What's Left, but how does the left identify itself? How does it think about itself? What is it doing? And then there came a point, I guess, Angela, where what the Jacobin left was doing and what you were doing parted company. How maybe explain what happened there, just as a way of framing our bigger picture discussion.
Well, I think the official parting company was an American Affairs piece called The Left Case Against Open Borders, which I kind of took a gamble on in the hope that some people would see the sense in what I was saying, and that some people hadn't gone, for me, just beyond a point where I could possibly, agree with them, or hadn't gone fully kind of anarchist, which is a trend that I saw kind of throughout the Bernie years, we'll say. But it was clear from the reaction, which was 100% negative, that this was now something you had to believe. So you basically couldn't believe in it, the nation state having any legitimacy whatsoever anymore. And so yeah, that kind of that move towards anarchist had really fully taken place by then, and that the very extreme response to the piece sort of made that just impossible to ignore. And it was also the moment where I realized that any hopes that I had had for the Bernie project, which did have signs of hope at the beginning, in my opinion, were over. I mean, at that point, I had to say, this thing has been completely, at this point, taken over by Malcolm and I have talked about it elsewhere, this kind of the youth wing of the kind of like professional class who are these overproduced elite aspirants, and that a lot of their kind of crazy ideology comes from their class role, basically. There's an awful lot of people from a kind of Peter Hitchens to like the neocons or whatever who did this right left or left right move throughout their life, but back in just a few years ago, like around 2016, 2017, a magazine like Jacobin was actually, I felt very much at home there, because they started out kind of publishing things that were actually quite critical of progressive neoliberalism or something like that. So I kind of I really felt at home there because of that critique. I often use as an example, they started off with an interview with Walter Ben Michaels, who wrote The Trouble with Diversity. So it really is a case of everyone else changed and I didn't,
So you have, I guess it would have been, what was that, 2017, where you sort of parted brass rags with the left?
No, it was 2018, kind of
okay.
Late in 2018. So I held on like beyond a point where I knew the whole thing was getting quite ridiculous, but because I kind of had always had this problem with the left. Like, I always felt that a lot of its economic projects were absolutely necessary, and I still do, but I simply couldn't accept much of its cultural projects. And and I did think that 2016 kind of opened up the possibility for a realignment that would be something closer to what I had always wanted it to be, but then it just went wildly off in the wrong direction, and it became this, the cultural politics kind of came to dominate to a point where I had to think like this is just so profoundly socially destructive and antisocial and almost like anti-civilisational at a certain point. But also, I mean, one thing that's sorry, this is a bit of a long answer, but one thing that has always kind of been a problem for me with the thing that we call the left is that you can kind of broadly define it as it always has some kind of egalitarian economic project and either a liberationist cultural project or one that you might say is trying to liberate people from the shackles of tradition in some way. So that would be true of even the Soviet Union, which is obviously you couldn't describe as libertarian or something culturally libertarian like you can the post-Cold War American left. But they all kind of have those two things in common. I think that's like the common thread. But in fact, those two things don't have any necessary connection whatsoever, really. There's no reason why a person has to have libertarian or liberationist cultural politics to believe in economic justice or equality.
I'm going to say something, but I want to define a term before I say it, which is, so in the American context, when we talk about class, I will a lot of times just use middle class for very broadly. So it's sort of, because I think that's the American conception, which it sort of encompasses the working class as well. So what I'm about to say, sort of, just know that's the way I'm thinking about it. But the way I've thought about an appropriate set of economic policies is predicated upon the fact that the state or the government has an outsized obligation to its own citizens versus non-citizens. That's number one. And that the most valuable asset that the American middle class has is its monopoly access or its asymmetric access to the U.S. labor market. And so to the extent that large corporations in partnership with the state fail to control borders, it's a form of economic warfare on the middle class, which impoverishes the middle class because it brings in labor competition that they would not otherwise have had, and as a result you get median wages stagnate or decline, and as a result it's harder to form families, buy houses, have kids, all just the normal features of life.
Yeah.
Does that seem, I mean, does that sound outlandish to you? Because there are elements of the sort of the libertarian right that would grow hives if they heard me say that.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the libertarian right, because one of the things that is sort of opaque about the left and sort of a recurring problem for the right in general, I would say, is that the right, when it tries to understand the left, focuses not on what these people actually do, but on what they say. And that's where you get a lot of this, like, oh, these Marxists, they want a proletarian revolution kind of, like almost like we're still in the Cold War or something. But the thing that you can notice if you follow along like channels internal to the left is just how like libertarians or libertarian ideology, anarchist ideology, it's completely dominant on the left today.
Malcolm, maybe you can sort of do what Angela did, which is you grew up in basically the Swedish leftist youth movement. And then you had a similar, I guess, road to Damascus moment where you became a non-denominational populist, which is a phrase I may steal from you, but I'll give you credit 3 times because a friend told me you have to give credit 3 times on these phrases, and then you're free to use it yourself.
Yeah, I heartily endorse your attempts to steal that because I think it's a pretty good phrase in our time. This is the time to be sort of a non-denominational populist and not hold fast to a lot of like outdated doctrine. But yeah, sure. Like the short version of my story, it's essentially that I joined the Left Party in 2010 or thereabouts. I mean, like I had been sort of a not terribly interested in politics, sort of social democrat before then. And then, I got radicalized into like the necessity of proletarian revolution or whatever. And, you join the left, and the left has this sort of internal culture where like you are part of the vanguard, you are part of the chosen sort of advanced intellectual caste that will lead the people into like the promised land, essentially. And I believed in that, and I didn't leave voluntarily. In fact, I got cancelled, kicked out, much the same way Angela did. But while Angela sort of took a stand for something that was like obviously controversial at that point, I just made the mistake of writing an analysis of why the left party didn't do that well among immigrant voters in Sweden. Because part of the like the left sort of self-image here is that, of course, we represent immigrants and, you know, women and everyone that's a marginalized group. Like all of them understand that the left is their movement, and that's why they support us and vote for us. But in practice, immigrants didn't generally vote for the left party, and the Sweden Democrats, the party that supposedly wanted to, you know, like gas all the immigrants in giant death camps or whatever, like they actually were very competitive among immigrants. So I tried to explain that using a sort of like materialist analysis, and that just ruffled the wrong feathers at the wrong time, essentially. Like if I had written that essay 8 months later, it wouldn't have been controversial at all. But ultimately, what gets you sort of kicked out in the left, and I will return to this point several times during this conversation, I think, but like the left is not about ideas. Ideas are not the driving force. Sure, people can say, oh yeah, I'm a Marxist-Leninist, I'm a blah, 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 but very little of that actually matters. Instead, what sort of paints a target on your back is usually just your willingness to go against consensus. Like even if you go against consensus and people sort of react to that and you can prove that you were in the right, like your argument had merit, it was correct or whatever. Like even if Marx himself rose from the grave and said, oh, you know, Malcolm actually, like I agree with him on this, like you should chill out. Like, yeah, sure, people would be really courteous while Marx walked the earth, but when he returned to heaven or hell or wherever he rests now, everyone would just turn on you in a flash, because the sin here wasn't being incorrect. The sin was essentially like you demonstrating a sort of faulty or like a disloyalty, essentially, by stepping outside of the circle of accepted like opinion. And so, yeah, I got kicked out of the left for writing that, and it was kind of a harrowing experience, because you really believe like all these sort of principles and ideals and so on, and you find out that like nobody else really does. And after that, me and a friend sort of got working on a like non-leftist populist party where we could actually still do what we joined the left to do, like the sort of economic justice that was actually, in our view, needed. Like we could pursue that without serving two masters, essentially. And I'm happy to say that like that political project is going pretty well at this point. And so my angle in all of this is that today you sort of see the realignment taking place within the right, where something similar is happening, where, you know, the old ideals, like the old view of conservatism and so on, like they've obviously been proven to be like insufficient. Like you can't actually do anything about the deaths of despair among the American working class by just sort of reciting warmed over Reaganism. And everyone kind of understands that. So at this point, the goal is to find some sort of way forward where you can actually try to salvage like some sort of community, like some sort of like a country that fits together almost. And in that sense, like we're all sort of fellow travelers at this point, I would say.
Yeah, there's this element where on the right where we've had this issue now well, it's been around for a while, but it's really come to a head in the past 5 years, where the right in America is basically the middle class. It's a middle class political movement that doesn't have much of a self identity at this point, though maybe that's forming, but that has found itself allied with a political elite that effectively sees itself as a mouthpiece for big business, because that was the sort of conception that it had 30 or 40 years ago. Sort of Eisenhower condemns the military industrial complex, and in the 50s and by sort of the 70s, Republicans are going, God, yeah, okay, okay, I guess we represent them now. And that's like the neocons plus, or just your sort of standard issue politician that has his hand out for corporate donations. What they haven't realized is actually their base of political support isn't corporate America. It's interior America. It's flyover people. It's deplorables. And so there's this contradiction between a lot of the political class on the right and the people who actually are voting for them. And that somehow needs to resolve itself. And that's where, in my view, that's one of Trump's most valuable roles, which is simply to bring about that realignment.
Yeah, and one thing that needs to be pointed out here is that this sort of drift between the political class and the sort of base, the actual like popular support structure that's needed for the political project to fit together. That sort of drift has happened within the left. And the big difference between the left and the right is that the left has embraced this. Like they've drawn the realignment on the left is complete. There's really nothing, like there's no fights left to be had. There's no battles that have yet to be fought. Essentially, people like me and Angela got the boot as just like, when you close down a pub or whatever, when you like put the tables put the chairs on the table and just turn off the lights. Essentially, it was just a cleanup phase, because
you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
Yeah, exactly. Like at this point, it's becoming incredibly clear that the forces of, like, if you take Labour in the UK or the Democrats in the US, like what they represent is just this sort of restoration of neoliberalism. So Trump recently said that essentially, you have a lot of people in the upper echelons of the Pentagon. They like war because they like getting jobs at Lockheed Martin, and people at Lockheed Martin like, selling planes that sort of fall out of the sky once you cross the dateline or whatever. And Democrats just said, oh my God, how can this guy say this? Like, please support the brave patriots at Lockheed Martin Corporation. And what you see on the radical left is basically, oh, God damn it. So now to be left, you sort of have to support the wars. I remember 10 years ago when being part of the left was, saying these things that Trump was actually saying. But nobody is willing to break ranks over it. It's just this kind of resignation over the fact that, okay, so these are our strange bedfellows now, and we can't really do anything about it. Everyone sort of realizes that, no, at this point, the Marxist left, the radical left, Jacobin, DSA, and so on, these people are just support troops for a coalition of like the top 10% of the population, essentially, and some like lumpen proletarian stooges, like the desperately poor, people who aren't connected to the formal economy, who will be placated by a bunch of government handouts, ideally. And
or
there's sort of
fans accounts.
Yeah, like a combination of those two. And there's sort of handlers who live very wealthy lives and who they don't need the US, they don't need the American working class, they sort of hate Americans or hate their own countrymen, and they're citizens of the world, but not in some sort of just like a moral sense, but rather in the sense that for them, the economic model that they prefer is one where what the American state actually prioritizes is just a couple of those sort of exclaves of rich urbanites, and they, like the American state, should be content with letting the rest of the country just rot.
So when you think about the elements of the left coalition in America, what do you think is their self-conception for each of those elements?
Yeah, Angela, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking one thing that is a real tell is how a lot of people who came into the left through, Bernie Sanders, really, it's a real tell that they've just kind of floated around from, being socialist to being anarchist. And, you can kind of be any of those things. But the one thing that you absolutely must be is on board with being a citizen of the world, being against nationalism, and being, a kind of socially destructive cultural libertarian, basically. That's the only thing you need to have to be part of this broad coalition. You can have a whole range of economic views that just are contradictory, that are all over the place, that are very moderate, that are very extreme. It's really just you have to be on board with that. What would you call it? A cultural, geopolitical kind of project. But in terms of how they conceive of themselves, well, obviously the people who are out rioting and stuff are mostly anarchists. I mean, I would say, or else some mostly self-aware kind of anarchists, insurrectionists of different types, and that's how they see themselves. And so every fake economic project is really about causing the possibility for that. So even, for example, when their only interest in trade unions, for example, is to get them to do something disruptive so that it will open up like a insurrectionary potential. A funny thing you often see about Michael Lind, who I really like, is one of the reasons that they dislike him so much is that he's always presenting these very successful models of collective bargaining and kind of industrial peace, So he often, I think, like the German model is one that he often references. That has absolutely no value for them.
Yeah.
Like if you could say to them, but it raised everyone's wages, they would. I don't think they would be able to compute that, but what they would be on some level kind of understanding is like, yeah, but it didn't cause the possibility for insurrection for us.
Yeah.
So that's no good. I don't care if it raises people's wages. I don't care if somebody's able to have a home or something like that. As a result, that's not the project. If you think that's the project, you're a total fool. So yeah, that's what they think they're doing. Now, as for the people in the kind of establishment or with those ambitions, I think, kind of as Malcolm alluded to, they regard the insurrectionists, kind of anarchist people on the street, as just, kind of a temporary necessity to terrorize people so that they can then swoop in and say, we're the true kind of law and order party, right? Because we will end the madness of the Trump era. This is the new line I noticed, by the way.
Yeah.
The only way to end the culture war and the kind of like the exhausting battle of the last few years is to get the establishment Dems back into power. And that's what people who probably identified as like socialists or like radical leftists are now saying. So they're essentially just saying vote for Biden. And so how can you possibly deny their utility as a temporary bullying force that just gets the establishment back into power?
I think it's useful to add to this that, well, I mean, the connection between these sort of middle class anarchists and the DC insiders and so on, like that connection won't be temporary, because a lot of the time these like weathermen or whatever are just their sons and daughters having their own like period of being super radical and so on. Like if you look at the social democrats here in Sweden, like the first sort of generation had a lot of so my friend, who's like an old sort of political part of a political family of nobility, essentially, like the first social democrat in that family, like his father worked in some like machine shop at the turn of the century or whatever and lost his arm or something, and so the son had to help him, beg for scraps to have money to eat, because I mean there was no OSHA at that time, let's just say. And but during the 70s, like all of these sort of old political activists are more or less gone. What you have instead is like the sons of daughters of this new nobility who just do all of this like really open sort of insurrectionist song and dance, where we have to kill all the bureaucrats to sort of give birth to the true socialist revolution. Like a lot of these people were just Maoists or some other like really crazy denomination, like student politics at that time. It was just insane. But like after a period of 10 years, all of these people just entered politics and everything was forgiven. And so these people, like not the sort of gangsters and sort of like professional looters or whatever, but the white red guards throwing over tables at restaurants because people are eating and not demonstrating against Trump. Like those people, they're going through this phase as their own sort of cursus honorum in order to then get a job at an NGO or whatever. And a lot of them are like openly angling for it. But on the other hand, the sort of self-conception of the left is that, oh no, we're totally the sort of plunky underdogs. We're against all of these sort of Democrats. My mom is a Democrat lib, but when the revolution comes, I'll personally execute her by shooting her in the head or whatever, because she's a boog. Like people have to have these sort of ideas, but it's kind of like in Catholicism, where like, because Catholicism is an institution that survived for a very long time, it has this sort of like almost genetic instinct on how to preserve itself. So to deal with like the inevitable loss of faith, you have all of these rituals and like institutional mechanisms that sort of preempt the loss of faith in the project or in the scripture, and sort of transform that into a confirmation of the innate like truth value of Catholicism, essentially. So as an institution, it's sort of gotten past that problem that a lot of like leftist cults have, where everyone's a Trotskyite for a couple of years and then everyone realizes that no, this isn't going anywhere. So what I want to say with this is actually that to understand the left like rhetoric, you kind of have to understand the function it serves. And a lot of this sort of, no, we're the true rebels, no, we hate the liberals and so on. Like this is just, all of this is sort of built to preempt the moment where these people just join Center for American Progress or whatever.
Yeah.
I want to come back to that. So let's just hold that thought for 1 second. But I do want to ask if you think there's some sort of like a generational aspect to this. Like, I mean, it's sort of like the millennials are reenacting their boomer parents' experience in the 60s and 70s, but now it's not new. Now it's institutionalized. And so it's like, it's kind of a weird thing where the 60s generation, at least maybe, was sort of authentic in the sense that it hadn't really been done in this country before, but now there's you can be highly tracked, like as millennials like to be, and you can be told how you go through this entire process. So I'm a radical in my 20s, I do some demonstrations, I punch a fascist, and then I get a job at an institution in DC that's lavishly funded by woke tithes and offerings from corporations. It's sort of like, it's not quite first as tragedy, then as farce, but there's a formulation like that. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, I think some people have made the comparison with the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the sense that it's like, it's almost like a riot or an insurrection to bring the establishment back into power, to reestablish power. And I think there's also a tension there because they're trying to, on the one hand, they're trying to do that, but they're also trying to get a seat at the table, like the millennials.
Yeah.
So you have this vast educated class of people who are, it's so interesting. I was looking at some of that guy, Andy Ingo, who's been posting all these mugshots of
Yeah.
anarchists getting arrested. And I'm amazed at how old they are. Like they're well, the same age as me. They're in their 30s. They're in their mid 30s. They're not like teenagers. And when I see people talking about going back to normal, I kind of think, how are these people ever going to go back to normal? There will be a kind of Sean McElwee type of person who just, effortlessly moves into the new elite and gets a place at the table. But there's also going to be a section of this whole crowd who are just going to be like lost souls, which there was in the 60s as well.
But it's larger this time around, I think, as a percentage of the generation. That's my view of it.
Yeah, because, when this is over, like Peter Turchin is now saying he's kind of predicting a period of about 5 years of civil conflict. These people will be 40 and they will, and I'm talking about the people who are getting arrested, right? So maybe not the most clever career people in this. And, there's no normal for them to get back to, and there's going to be this whole generation of lost people who they're not going to have any children. And, it will be too late by then. They're not going to, they'll be, they're very highly educated, but they're not going to make it, they're not going to be part of the group that makes it into the elite. And as I say, lots will, because if you look at even the vast sums of money going into all these NGOs now, all of that money will turn into jobs, like make work. I mean, imagine if you had tens of millions to just employ full-time activists for some cause. You could completely change the country, basically, and they will. But they're all going to be brought into the successful ones among this group of protesters will be brought into that and will be given full-time like sinecures and stuff like that as dedicated activists. And so this is good. They're going to be lingering around for God knows how long.
Decades.
Yeah.
Like the fight. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, just on this generational thing, I agree with you, Angela. There's the millennials had sort of the cards stacked against them to begin with. Sort of science and technology stagnate, growth stagnates. It's tough to get a meaningful employment. We overproduce elite aspirants led by a multiple of the number of positions that could possibly be available. And so you've got all of these frustrated hopes, and then at the same time, sort of millennials should be getting jobs during the Great Recession, 2008, 9, 10. And then so that makes things difficult as they're starting careers and lives and things. And then 10 years later, maybe people are starting to get some sort of semblance of normalcy and momentum behind their lives and careers. And now you have sort of the COVID economy, and that makes it more difficult. And so a lot of this, like one frame that I have on this is that when you look at the intra-class strife of elite aspirants, of these people who are educated but don't have jobs that match their education or self-conception, is that it's like a resource war between countries. It's like this is how you struggle to actually get to a place where you can have a somewhat stable income that you feel more or less matches what you were trained to do.
You even see this with if you look at the intense hatred that they have for, like, even say within the media, right? The intense, really obsessed hatred they have for kind of older liberal columnist types, they seem to reserve like a level of obsessive hatred of those people that doesn't quite make sense. And I used to always think, why is it like it doesn't really, like, this person is like not saying anything that terrible, but it's because they want their jobs. They want the boomers, the liberal boomers, to go away and retire so that they can have their jobs. So I mean, it really is like a resource competition in that sense.
Yeah, and the thing is here that if you want to understand like the different factions within the left, you sort of have to realize that, number one, like all of the factions fit within this sort of narrative of, all of these are part of the same side in the resource war, but they do have different sort of tactical they have different plans or different ideas of like how to go about it. So if you look at like Bernie Bros, for example, a lot of that stuff was just, and I know Amy Therese has talked a lot about this, but essentially, if you look at like Medicare for all, for example, like what this is in reality is subsidy for people who are in this, who are sort of getting arrested in Portland right now. So people who are too old to like live on their parents' insurance and who aren't desperately poor, because those people are covered by Medicaid, and who aren't old because those people are covered by Medicare. But it's just like taken together with, free college and so on. Like the Bernie campaign, in a way, like it didn't really understand itself in that way. But in practice, it was sort of, well, okay, the way we sort of solve this is by social democracy for all of these millennials, essentially. And of course, there's all this rhetoric about how, it'll be really great for the working class, but it probably won't actually. And that's not really the goal. And then you sort of have these people who, like Sean McKelvey is a good example. Like he essentially says that, no, this is a really stupid idea. The votes aren't there. Like you can't really win. Bernie Sanders can't really win electorally, at least in a Democratic primary, using the strategy. So what we should do instead is we should actually get all the never Trumpers on board. And that way we can sort of have, this class of political operators that I belong to be the new sort of liaisons to the Chamber of Commerce or whatever, after all the conservatives have sort of switched sides or become populists. And yeah, there's a lot of like really heated language between these different sides where one accuses the other of being like an enemy of the proletariat or whatever. But at the end of the day, nobody ever questions that, like, of course we should do this hand in hand with the Democratic Party. Like the farthest you see people say is that, well, we should work hand in hand with the Democratic Party, but we should be really like loud about how much we don't like them. Like the idea, for example, that you could have some sort of political coalition with sort of populist elements on the right, like that's not ever even seriously considered. Because again, everyone is on the same side. They just have different priorities and different ideas about like what will work, what will sort of save these millennials.
Is the most important animating force on the left now the cultural liberationist element versus, and the sort of all the economic stuff is at best a second tier priority?
Yes and no. I mean, look, like there's a really fascinating political struggle taking place in the UK right now, where you have this sort of Brexit agreement being hashed out. And so one of the conflicts between the EU and the UK government is about the rules that the EU has in place to sort of prevent governments from, interfering with markets, essentially. And the Tories, with Boris Johnson in the lead, are saying that, no, we can't agree to play by these EU rules about, the free market is supreme. Because, like, if we're supposed to be a sovereign nation, we have to have the ability to actually affect change here. We have to sort of have the competency to say that, no, actually, we're going to support like this sector of the economy because it's strategically important for the future and so on. And you know what happens? The labor left and labor in general is like completely discombobulated. So it's either everyone is just being silent, or they're just saying that actually, governments shouldn't interfere with free markets because that's just like fascism or corporatism or crony capitalism or whatever. So like we should have more neoliberalism, essentially. And so the point I'm making here is just that, sure, at first glance, it seems like the left only fights all of these cultural battles. But in reality, they only fight cultural battles insofar as people sort of fail to notice all the economic battles they are taking place in or taking part of, and like the sides they're actually picking. So nobody can deny that, like, whether the UK should have the ability to decide its own economic policy is an economic rather than cultural issue. But here, the left is actually actively taking the side against economic sovereignty. And sure, they don't
Yeah,
like
I
talking
think
about this, but they
yeah, I think
do.
that's the important thing. Like, I used to years ago, I used to kind of try to make the argument within that sphere that, we have to focus more on economics. We can't be constantly fighting these cultural battles that are very off-putting to the average person, that kind of thing. And I still see people making that argument now that it's basically totally safe to do so. But that's not right, actually. I think what Malcolm said is completely right, which is that it is an economic battle. So, I mean, like, the main theme of Trump's campaign in 2016 was really kind of reshoring. It was very much about tariffs. It was very much about bringing jobs back and things like that. That is objectively a working class project, whereas the left's one really was, as Malcolm said, social democracy for millennials. Like, that's really what it was. And so, but the problem is that it's not that they are not interested in the economic stuff. It's that they can't say what the class project is.
Yeah.
Because if they just came out and said that, it would completely demystify and remove all of the moral fervor that they have if they just said that. And so that's the one thing that they absolutely cannot do. And so it is an economic project. It is a class project. And, the social democracy for millennials aligns with, like, when they say all of this anti-borders, anti-nation stuff, I think the motto of, like, the socialism conference in 2019 was like, no bosses, no borders, no binaries. When they say all that stuff, they're signaling to the elites that the kind of in just a few major cities who, that basically they have the same essential worldview, and that also social democracy for millennials is compatible with the project of, like, Silicon Valley or the American elites, whereas reshoring and that kind of stuff that had that appeal to, the kind of heartland working class that supported Trump, that's not part of their project whatsoever. And so that is really the clash here. Like, that is the class conflict that is going on right now. And it's kind of, you can see it kind of along, like, territorial or geographic lines, but it is really an economic conflict.
So when you say social democracy for millennials, is it another way of saying that maybe that it is underemployed, college educated or better millennials who basically are saying, give me a better paying job and I don't care what happens to everybody else?
But it's not even give me a better paying job, though. They know that the fields that they want, the high prestige fields that they want to work in, are mostly just economically worthless. And so the only way they can accept what they would like is to keep their low paying, high prestige job, but then for that to be supported by by a kind of social democratic safety net. So I remember on occasion, like, talking to people, in that world, and they would often say, like, not a single one of them had any kind of medical coverage, and all of them had college debt. Now, they could solve that, of course, if they were to go and, like, leave these kind of, like, tiny little hubs where all these people network with each other in Brooklyn and places like that. If they were to leave there and just get an ordinary job, they could actually solve that. But they want to keep that foothold that they have, because they feel that they're so close, to this elite. They can go out on the weekend and talk to like the editor of a major publication, or they can, like, rub shoulders with the genuine elites, but they can't quite get there. So if they could just get that economic safety net of getting rid of college debt and getting medical coverage, then they could keep their high prestige but undercapitalized kind of sector job, and they could just go on like that forever.
So
Yeah.
basically, this is saying all this is solving for the very particular problems of a small subset of frustrated 35-year-olds.
Yeah, and can I just say one thing about that? I've heard sort of a counter argument to that, which is that I think somebody was writing they were trying to they were saying that like this is a silly view of how class works, because how could millennials who don't even earn that much have so much power? But that's not the point. The point is that this radicalized millennial faction are in an absolute panic, whereas the people who are like controlling the commanding heights of the economy are not. They're doing great, actually. So the point is that you have these people who have a lot of time, who are rubbing shoulders with elites but don't actually have that much money, and they are in a panic because they're terrified of the possibility that they will lose that prestige, and then they will have nothing. And they usually work in sectors where what they produce actually has no real value. They're not producing anything even physical. So they trade entirely in the skill that they trade on, the thing that gives what they do value is reputation and prestige. They trade almost exclusively in those things, so they absolutely have to hang on to those, and without those they have nothing.
Yeah, and they don't really have that much power. Like that's if you look at these riots in Portland, for example, like contrast them to the riots in LA and like Watts, where okay, this goes on for 6 days and then like 14,000 National Guard troops come in. Like I'm sorry, but like these middle class anarchists in Portland haven't fought off like 14,000 National Guard troops sent out by the evil Orange Man, and now like Pentagon is scrambling to come up with like enough army divisions to send in. Like these people have been rioting for 100 days because someone else is letting them do that. So like it's only all of these like weird ideas, it's only on college campuses, guys. Like all of that stuff is only sort of significant insofar as it is tolerated or tacitly sort of supported by like a powerful faction of the elite. And without that sort of support, like it doesn't really matter how many temper tantrums some blue-haired sort of like gender fluid queer throws at the in New Haven, because nobody like that tantrum and $2 will get you a cup of coffee essentially. So the thing to understand here is that the left, like the broad left to the left of the Democratic Party, all of these people have two choices. They can either be completely irrelevant, like the Communist Party of the USA or whatever, like some Bob Avakian cult, and nobody even knows that they exist. Or they can play nice, like obviously officially they're still like mortal enemies of the Democrats, but they still, play nice with the powers that be. And at that point, they can have enough sort of significance that they can keep recruiting new members on the like pretension that actually guys were just rebels, right? So it's kind of like a resistance movement, like funded entirely by the State Department or something.
So what's in it for the elites? Is that there's a I mean, I assume it's a sort of multivariable equation. Part of it is a cultural affinity. Part of it is it's probably literally their children in a number of cases. Some of it maybe is free advertising that you can get chits. Sort of like BLM became a corporate movement in about 5 minutes flat, and it was a way to signal what a nice corporation you are. And by the way, buy our sneakers.
Yeah, I mean, look, like, why do you keep contrasts around, for example? It's usually because it's very useful to have this sort of semi-dependent formation that's not officially sort of representing you. So if they really mess up and do something really stupid, you can say, well, these people, like, they have nothing to do with us. And if they're useful, you can sort of, misplace a couple of crates of weapons or whatever in a place to find them. And so the problem that these people have, like if you take the European Union, like the elites in the EU, for example, like the problem they have is that they have no sort of basis in popular, like democratic. They have no popular democratic support, essentially. So every time you put something up to a vote, like the new constitution of the EU or whatever, it's just defeated until an election can be engineered enough that the right sort of alternative wins. And, the elites in the EU have been very candid about that. When they sort of propose some change that they really want, if it gets defeated, it's going to happen anyway. It's going to be sort of reproposed and reproposed until it wins. And if it can't even win on the fifth sort of attempt, they're just going to implement it by fiat, essentially. So if you don't have any sort of political legitimacy, even in a situation where in the West, like all sort of nation state governments still, like their political legitimacy comes from essentially being democratic, representing the will of the people. Like you need to come up with some way of circumventing your lack of democratic support. And this is where the left, it's kind of like, the skunk works at Lockheed Martin or something, like this sort of experimental laboratory where you're just given money and you can sort of play around and come up with like new stealth spy plane concepts or whatever. And a lot of that will be crap, sure, but some of those concepts will be actually useful. Like a lot of what happens on Tumblr is not particularly politically useful to the EU Commission or whatever. But like this entire sort of mode of understanding politics that is becoming very popular today, where the left sort of talks about, working class people as essentially like innately fascist, evil, and the only sort of way to have a democratic workers' movement is to make sure workers have no political agency whatsoever because they'll just fuck everything up. Like that sort of narrative spinning is actually like critical today because every ruler needs to justify their own rules somehow. Do you see where I'm going with this? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine, just to illustrate the point, in the British context of the EU that you gave, imagine if they had not had the radical left there to go and say everyone who supports Brexit is, I think like gammon was the term they were using, like this really weird racialized term. Everyone who they needed the Owen Jones and the Ash Sarkar. They needed people to go out and scream their heads off and beat people up and, terrorize people and constantly like kind of go too far in like humiliating and degrading like people who voted that way, like working class Brits who were pro-Brexit. They needed those younger radicals to go and do that. But also to be filled with this kind of like religious fervor that, and moral certainty, because imagine if they hadn't been there, you would have just had a bunch of boring bureaucrats from the EU be as the only representatives of this project, and that would have just revealed it too accurately as what it is. So similarly, you can't have, like in the American context, you can't just have like Jeff Bezos or somebody come out and say, look, here's why our economic project benefits from the idea of globalization. Instead, you have to have, a radical young person being like, no borders, and crying at the border and stuff like that. You know what I mean? It helps to give the impression that you're not just looking at a bureaucrat, you're not just looking at the elite, just explicitly saying what they want. that would just reveal the class dynamics of the thing too easily,
Yeah.
There's an element here, Angela, where it's like where every time somebody says children in cages at the border, what that really translates into is let's flood the country with cheap Chinese manufactured goods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's you sort of have to realize that like this is it's so necessary to have this sort of symbiosis between like the putative radicals and the people who are supposedly, oh no, I hate radicals, I really dislike all these rioters in Trump's America, but it's Trump's fault and blah blah blah. Like this is what produces the situation where, sure, if you're on the left, it's like, yeah, dude, I have all these Marxist ideas or whatever. I hate, the European Union. And then suddenly the conflict becomes one where the European Union says, I'm sorry, like, you can't actually have any sort of control over the free market. That's, like, even if you put it up to a vote, we're not going to allow that. And everyone just falls silent because they realize that, like, this is the Japanese telling the emperor of Manchuria that, like, okay, yeah, fine, we're committed to this sort of idea of you being totally independent or whatever, but this order comes straight from the army high command, so shut up and sit down. Like, every time this conflict comes to a head, where it's like it's completely obvious that no matter if you like the Tories or not, the idea that some sort of unelected bureaucrats should be able to tell your nation no, you can't actually have laws, even if like this side wins a democratic election on a promise to, I don't know, subsidize this or that industry to make sure there are jobs. You can't do that. Like, no sort of interpretation of Marxism will ever tell you that this is a position that's not inimical to the project of socialism or whatever. Like, there's no room for discussion at all. But everyone realizes that this is the side the bread is buttered on, and everyone shuts up.
Yeah, I always thought that Jeremy Corbyn never got the memo, right? And deep in his heart, he was a closet Brexiteer and was, probably confused, thinking like I'm representing the Labour Party, but
but he did.
That's so true. Yeah, that's very, very true. And actually, what's funny? Like one of the reasons why I was very excited by the rise of Jeremy Corbyn initially was precisely that. Like he was quite old-fashioned in many ways. And, and the same is true of Sanders. He was not an open borders person for his whole career. But you also see...
but he did get the memo that he had to
He did, yeah. Yes, he absolutely did get the memo.
Because those three houses aren't going to pay for themselves.
Well, at some point, I remember when he announced that he was running the second time, and he did this video and it was just filled with, I mean, like I said somewhere else, it was like he was taken hostage and he was reading out it was like, what on earth is this? It's not the person who ran into 2016 but what's funny too is that it's mad to think of it now, but there was actually an article written in The Nation about the danger of left nationalism and how we all have to, and it was a big, like, I think it must have been in the print edition. It was like, or if there even is a print edition anymore, it was like the big feature of the edition, and it was all about the dangers of left nationalism. And it's so comical to think of it now because, of course, like just a couple of months later, the British left was like completely destroyed, like by suicide, basically, because it wasn't nationalist enough. But yeah, that's what liberals and this kind of coalition of the radical left and kind of the elites were banking on, that this would work. They had also like a picture of, I remember on that article, they had a picture of Jeremy Corbyn, they had a picture of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and they had God, I've forgotten her name right now. Who's the German lady who
Sarah Wagenknecht.
Yeah, that's right. They had all those figures on it, and they were really trying to they were really trying to make this idea stick, that we were all going to be terrorized by the rise of left nationalism. It's like just unbelievable. It was just a way of disciplining,
Yeah.
disciplining. If anyone got any ideas that they were going to diverge in any way from the project, the globalization project, just to remind them, if you do this, all this nice media coverage that you could get is going to disappear.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I was just going to say that, like, they didn't need all this discipline because everyone was really ready to fall in line. Unlike the right, where today you have like actual sort of splits, people going separate directions and so on. Like, who are the fucking never Trumpers on the left? It's like you and me and like 3 other people who sort of say, oh, well, we can't sort of compromise on what we joined the left to do. I'm sorry, goodbye. Like everyone else, it doesn't matter if it's like Silicon Valley murdering strikers or whatever. They're gonna say, oh, I don't really like all this like strike breaking and all these murders, but we have to really be afraid of, Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard or whatever. Those are the real threats to the working class.
Is there, do you think, this is for both of you, but is there some sort of essential point that you think the right just doesn't understand about the left?
Oh, yeah, lots. There's so many. I mean, one of them, for example, I hear it all the time now that like Joe Biden is going to usher in communism. And like, it's just such a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on. The simple question to ask is like, why is every powerful corporation in the world supporting a project that you think is going to end in, people going in with guns and like, taking their wealth away? Like, that's just not going to happen. That is not the project. And he is not out there. Nobody in this is going to be increasingly just a party for the elites and for these other groups who kind of live in the same cities as them, but are sort of lumpen or are these kind of vigilante forces in the case of the rioters and so on. That's not what it is. It's a globalization project, and it's certainly an anti-nationalist project, like that's implicit. But that is, and so I think that when you say, look at these Marxists, you kind of in a way help them in their own propaganda project to conceal what is actually going on. That is they want to be thought of in that way. They want to be thought of as radicals. So when you point out that they're extreme or radical or something like that, or they're like, they're Marxists, it's just, as I say, it's you're helping them in their own propaganda project. And so I think that's kind of the big one. I mean, I just was watching yesterday an interview with Douglas Murray, which was on this British kind of online show called Trigonometry, and they were, many of the things they were saying about the cultural left are totally accurate, but then they saw it as part of this like communist takeover or something like that, and that's really not what it is. I mean, and you just have to, anyone who says that's what it is would have to try to explain why it is that every major corporation in America is supporting it.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as you mean by communism mean like the destruction of the sort of like mom and pop stores and being replaced by sort of semi-official state-backed monopolies, like maybe, but it's not because Marx told them that this was the way forward. I'm sorry. I think to add to your point, Angela, like one of the big mistakes the right keeps making here is like putting undue focus on the world of ideas. Like if I wanted to understand, for example, I'm just going to take an example at random. Like why, for example, does the US tacitly allow pharmaceutical companies to poison and like essentially like massacre the American population? And if I like try to get an answer to that by sort of looking at these old 2014 era discussion from Aspen Institute or whatever about like what is true conservatism, and like the free stools of the conservative or free legs of the conservative stool in movement republicanism, movement conservatism, I wouldn't understand. Like what is the libertarian argument here? Is it that like this 22-year-old single mother on fentanyl, like her marginal utility of a opioid high for 15 seconds, like she's a rational economic actor just deciding that like I'm going to feel really good for 15 seconds and then I'm going to die of an overdose, but the marginal utility of feeling really good for 15 seconds is so much better than watching my kids grow up. Like no,
Malcolm, is just a revealed preference. All the
yeah,
libertarians
yeah.
assure me of that.
Yeah, exactly. But like that's ridiculous. This isn't about ideas. Like it's very, very, very simple. You don't have to think about revealed preferences here. You have to think about like economic preferences, and not with the mother in particular, because like addiction is not an intellectual thing. It's like often a physiological change that you really can't, like it's slavery essentially. But like there are a lot of companies who make a lot of money off of this. And behind the nice sort of ideas, the free legs of the or conservative stool and so on, like there's naked economic interest here. And so the job of the intellectuals, I'm sorry to say, a lot of the time it's just after the fact trying to come up with an excuse for something that was going to happen anyway, because like powerful interests were interested in it happening. Like there's no intellectual debate that you can win or lose that's going to change like the distribution of fentanyl here. Like, so the left works exactly the same. In some ways, it's even more blatant at this point. Like, if you actually, I'm serious. If you actually read Marx, you're going to be put on some list somewhere, because and this actually happened in the Soviet bloc. Like the best way to not get promoted and to get put on like the special interest list for the local sort of secret police was actually to read Capital or whatever, because someone who read Capital could potentially argue for why the direction everyone's going along with is kind of a mistake, maybe even kind of evil. We don't want that. We want pliable people who are really interested in the world of ideas, sure, but realize that when that nice Japanese officer say, "Oh, I'm sorry, my emperor, this isn't a good idea," he's not actually, giving you counsel. He's giving you an order. And so, yeah, like if you look at the world of ideas without understanding like the sort of power dynamics at play, you are going to either sort of, at best, you're going to be completely lost in the woods. At worst, you're going to be complicit in helping these people further their agenda, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, having grown up on the right, I mean, there's an obsession with the world of ideas, and people like to say ideas matter and ideas have consequences. And of course, that's a true statement, but you can also overstate and overemphasize the truth there. And there's sort of an sometimes explicit, oftentimes implicit belief that if you look at, if you try and do any sort of materialist analysis of the world, that somehow somehow it's just a little too red, right?
Yeah.
and that's. Well,
yeah.
Materialist analysis, again, like the world of ideas, it's imperfect, but it does give you a particular way of framing some things that's helpful in understanding the world. Because whether you do it from an idealist or a materialist perspective, what you're trying to do is just get a good understanding of what's actually happening around you.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the time there's this sort of all or nothing way of thinking about this, especially on the right, because like materialism has been this sort of like chosen enemy for like political reasons during the Cold War, where it's like, okay, so you're a materialist, so you just think that everything is about the profit motive or whatever, which is just kind of an inversion of how libertarians think about the world.
That's right. Yeah.
But I like to think of it as, sure, ideas do matter, but what we have to have a sort of, I kind of want to say a scientific understanding of almost, is what sort of circumstances favor these sorts of ideas. So like if we take the American right as an example, like obviously all of these old sort of ideas that Trump gave voice to, like he didn't invent an entirely new way of thinking that no human had ever thought before, but rather like he was the right man at the right place because this sort of how American society looked and the sort of conflicts between like the middle class and the elites were sort of reinforcing the truth value in what Trump was saying. And so why do you have people like Orin Cass with American Compass talking about ideas that had been buried for a very long time? Well, I mean, there's sort of a demand for them. They sort of respond to an actual kind of like, biological mutations or whatever. Like obviously, whether you have thick fur or not kind of matters for temperature regulation, but it's not necessarily a good idea to have really thick fur in the middle of a desert. And so, as the climate changes, the sort of mutations that are favored also change. And so the thing here that you mentioned earlier that like, okay, well, it's good to talk about revealed preference and like all these economic ideas and so on, but you shouldn't really think like who benefits because that's a bit too red. Like that same paranoia is extant in the left today. Like if you actually ask the wrong kind of question, you are attacked as being essentially a fascist. And me and Angela has a lot of experience with this. Let's just say, why are you writing this at this time, Angela? Like, what's your agenda? Who do you serve?
Yeah, and I also think that the right needs to. I think I listened to you guys talking before on this podcast, and you were saying, Chris, about how it's almost like the machine or whatever the like institutions have not caught up with these kind of class shifts that we're talking about. But the main, like if I could give any advice, I would say somebody needs to find a way to change that really fast, because the only thing that gives, everyone's seeing kind of the left in action now, right? As they go around terrorizing elderly couples having lunch and things like that, and seeing what it is. And it's so obviously a very ugly thing. And then they're seeing the more elite version of that within the party. The thing that should be very moralizing to the right is that they have, almost like without trying, they have this like, working class support, and that's, I think that exposing the class project of the left is absolutely the most powerful thing you can do. Stop saying they're communists. Just expose the elite cultural project and economic project that they're engaged in.
Yes.
Because that will reveal that will strip them of this like fake, this baseless moral righteousness that they have.
Yeah. Democrats don't get mad if you call them communists, but
No.
just look at Trump saying that actually the military industrial complex, it exists. And everyone just loses
They've lost their
minds. Even though supposedly this is the thing that everyone on the left is supposed to believe. Like just Trump pointing it out that these are the interests at play forces everyone to just say, yeah, well, screw you, Trump. You can't talk about my generals like this. And it really is that like methinks the lady doth protest too much thing going on. And again,
When I speak, I've been saying this for a while, which is the socialism thing is a big mistake because for a number of reasons. Rhetorically, it's a bad idea. If we spend 8 years during the Obama administration saying Obama's a socialist or Obama's a communist, and for some people that they believed that and said, well, I don't know, things look pretty good. If this is socialism, can we have more of it? But there's another element of it where it's just not true. And what the Democrats' project really is corporatism or crony capitalism, whatever you want to call it. And I've had this. So I mean, I've been telling people this for a while. Just call it what it actually is, which is actually worse and is rhetorically and politically much more powerful. And when I've had this experience when I've been on sort of, left-wing media or speaking before largely sort of center-left boomer audiences, especially, where I've said, the Democratic Party is the party of the corporate oligarchy. It's a corporate party today. And I would have been more popular had I held up a crucifix at a vampire convention.
Yeah. I think Tucker Carlson is actually a really excellent example here, because in politics it's kind of like, words, concept, they're like magic wands or whatever in Dungeons and Dragons. So you have like 10 fireballs in a wand and then it sort of just runs out of juice. And like the truth value of a word like socialism or whatever, like being against socialism, it kind of runs out as well. Like the sort of signified concept.
That's right.
Yeah. It just slips from everyone's sort of memory. Yeah, sure. Maybe like the parents of this immigrant from like Eastern Europe knew what socialism is. But like none in this conversation is going to get really mad about like the War of the Roses or whatever, even if we had ancestors who fought in it, because it's like, that happened a couple of 100 years ago. And so what Tucker Carlson does, which I think is very interesting, is that he's obviously sort of shook off the need to actually use all of these like hand-me-downs, these hand-me-down concepts that no longer ring true. And so he's not like, when he talks, it's not a lot of jargon. It's just like, okay, so this is the conflict that's going on because of these and these reasons. And nothing pisses leftists off more than, Tucker Carlson saying, this isn't a race war, it's a class war because of these and these sides have these and these interests. Like the left, the real Marxist left, is actually currently being forced into being like even more obscurantist and like even more jargony, because they no longer have any sort of ability to explain what they're doing and what their enemies are doing without essentially retreating to rehashing like, oh, well, Rosa Luxemburg wrote this about like the national bourgeoisie 120 years ago. It's so fucking true today, man. Like, never have I seen something more true than what Rosa Luxemburg wrote about the Polish upper nobility like 140 years ago. And it's like, no. Dude, you can talk about Amazon without sort of having Amazon be a stand-in for the Polish nobility. And as soon as you do that, it's like, throwing, like you sort of invite the light of truth to shine equally on everyone, and not everyone today likes that, actually. Like there's this quote like, when the tide recedes, you really see who's been swimming naked. I think it was by Warren Buffett or whatever. And essentially, like going from talking in all this jargon and just trying to describe reality as truthfully and in as simple terms as you can, that really reveals who's sort of swimming without any swimming trunks and who isn't.
Can I want to switch gears just a little bit. Angela, I've heard you talk once or twice at least about the left taking, I'm going to paraphrase here, so correct anything that you think is a misstatement, but sort of the left taking almost a perverse pleasure in the desecration of relationships and of sort of the mercenary nature of the left's view of even family relationships and, sort of a lack of capacity for friendship and that sort of thing. When you said that, I think it was on a What's Left episode maybe a month or two ago, that just jumped out at me as being so important. And I don't know, I just wanted to ask you about that ever since.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of something that is possibly not fully explained by some of the stuff we've been talking about. That is something that is kind of pathological, and I'm not sure I even have a full explanation of it. It's just like kind of an observation, except in the sense that these are ways of forms of kind of loyalty and solidarity that means that they don't have complete control. But whatever its origins or how to explain it, I mean, it is cult-like. I think other people have said that cults always try to get people to disavow their family and friends and things like that. But it certainly is. I mean, it's a good point to emphasize so that people can kind of see, I guess, the very ugly antisocial nature of the whole thing, And also, I mean, they don't have anything to replace this with. I mean, however bad the 68ers may have been, they did have impressive intellectuals. They did have, it is somewhat plausible that they could, they had some better idea or some more beautiful idea of society that they're working towards. But now that isn't even there. It really is just desecrating things that people hold dear as a way of demoralizing and terrorizing them.
What is the sort of thing that you have observed?
Well, I mean, I guess the destruction of, I mean, there's the statues and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. Making everyone watch the statues being taken down and having paint thrown on them and, stomped on and stuff like that. There's, even like aesthetically, I mean, one thing that's really interesting that I have yet to really read Camille Paglia used to talk about it a bit, and she described it well, but I've never really heard a good explanation for it, which is the way in which, if you look at the sexual politics of the left, on the one hand, they want to have everyone be a sex worker and stuff like that, right? So they're anti-puritanical in that sense. But they also are very preoccupied with like uglification. So you'll see these kind of totally bizarre looking, like horrifying looking people who are also wanting to show you their naked bodies for some reason, So it's like they don't want. It's not that they just want sexual liberation. They really do kind of seem to take pleasure in uglification and kind of forcing people to see things that are ugly.
Yeah, this is something that I've thought a lot about, is that, and you're actually sort of helped me think about it in a somewhat different, but really, I think, useful way, which is there's like this war on beauty, and there's a war on health or vitality in a certain way. I mean, I've seen it all over social media. If you show somebody who is obviously fit and good looking, that's fascist. And God forbid if you show a family together doing something totally normal outside and looking, sort of good looking and happy, well, that's uber fascist. And the war on beauty and the war on health, it just, I'm not quite sure what to say about it, because it's so anti-human.
Here in Sweden, there was this incident where someone, because we have like an architect guild essentially, and everyone's agreed that the best sort of building, it's just a concrete box. And that's the only thing that should be built in this country. It's a concrete box, and like if you paint the part of the concrete box pink or whatever, that's genius level. So you should get some sort of like guild award or whatever for building this completely beautiful pink concrete building. And so you had a private sort of landlord who wanted to build a new building, like for tenants essentially. And he wanted to build like one of those, houses that you see if you go to Hamburg or Lübeck or whatever. So sort of 18th, 19th century European townhouses, essentially. And it became like a national campaign to stop that construction. Like, because obviously the problem was that they couldn't really hit him on zoning because he owned he owned the property. So the municipality couldn't deny him like property to build on. But everyone was just open about the fact that, building this sort of old building, and the guy just said, I like these buildings because they look nice. I think that concrete boxes look ugly, and I think that like old European sort of inner city towns look pretty nice. So I want to build something beautiful. Everyone just said openly, like this wasn't a subtext. People said openly that if you allow people to just have these sorts of opinions, this is the antechamber to fascism, essentially. That like the moment you sort of glorify some sort of something that's not reducible to which is what beauty is, essentially, like its most notorious qualities, that you can't reduce beauty to exchange value, essentially. Like you can't put an economic price tag on it very easily. And the moment you sort of start glorifying all of these things, you are essentially saying that like parties like the Sweden Democrats, again, this wasn't a subtext, people were saying openly, parties like the Sweden Democrats essentially say that like the nation should be about community and, belonging and watching your kids grow up and so on. And this is fascism. And beautiful buildings, that's just another front of it, because the benefit of concrete boxes is that like they're built to essentially be functional and nothing more. Like it's just a space to live in. It's not something beautiful. It's not something that like reminds you of history or whatever. And that's the nice thing about them. And so like part of this is some sort of political instinct, I would say, where people sort of realize that like if you open this can of worms, if you allow people to actually prioritize things that are like not completely reducible or not that don't fit in within like late capitalist alienation, essentially, like living in a pod and eating a bug or whatever because the bug has more protein than whatever else. Like you can't really open that can of worms because you don't know how easy it will be to close again.
There's an analog here, right, with sort of the narrative that if I don't know, a 35-year-old man is dating a 25-year-old woman, that's predatory and that's grooming, but it's totally fine and empowering if it's occurring on OnlyFans. If it's an economic exchange, it's great.
Yeah, I've seen people just say that.
But how do you? Yeah, but that is a good explanation, the economic exchange. But it's also, I mean, I just feel intuitively, having kind of observed it over a very long time, that there is also some almost like sadistic element to it that's hard to explain as well, like that even goes beyond that, where they, and you really see this coming out in the riots. I mean, the kind of people that are there and it's like they, I mean, the example that's actually coming to mind is not a very radical left one, but I remember Camille Paglia talking about the TV show Girls and the way in which it, on the one hand, like exposed the audience to a lot of very sexually explicit stuff and the naked body and so on, but it was not intended to be sexually attractive. It was very deliberately intended to make the audience feel disgusted and uncomfortable. And so, I mean, I as I say, I haven't really heard a good explanation for that. I mean, they would say something like, "Oh, we're taking back, we're taking this back from the male gaze or whatever, you know." But you still have to wonder, like, what is going through the mind of someone who's like, "I am going to make you look at something that is going to make you feel extremely uncomfortable and disgusted."
But I think part of the explanation here, if you look at the Soviet Union, for example, like when everyone sort of knew that things were kinda bad a lot of the time. If you were some sort of truth teller, just like this sort of social idiot who just said, "No, this is unjust, I'm gonna protest," like the people around you would not go, "Oh man, I'm not as brave as that guy. He's going to get, carted away to some sort of Siberian penal camp or whatever. But I'm glad he exists." No, like if you occupy that position, people around you who knew what you were saying was correct would actually often be sort of tempted to just be like sadistic, to sort of move you down a peg. Like, because again, your bravery is just an illustration of their weakness. And so I think that like the left kind of invites everyone into this crab bucket. And if you actually start complaining about the conditions within the crab bucket or like the hypocrisies or whatever, this actually engenders a lot of sadism. Because again, who are you to try to climb out of the crab bucket? Like, who are you to say, no, like crabs can live in the sea or whatever, when everyone else has already sort of made the deal with the devil and sort of accepted that, no, we're all crabs, we're going to live in this bucket until we die. Like, you're sort of like the capitulation that a lot of these like leftists go through actually results into a sort of desire to punish people until everyone is like walking through life with as bent a back as they are. So I think that's part of it actually, because it's an open secret that a lot of these sort of ideals that the left holds when it comes to like relations and so on, like nobody really likes bugmen, for example. Like very few people find bugmen attractive, or so I've heard. But like that's the official sort of truth, that like this is like we can't have a bunch of toxic masculinity and so on and so forth. And so like the dealing with that sort of doublethink, I think, leads to all of these pretty violent excesses at times. Like, here's the thing. In the example I used, like all of these architects that basically tried to get the architect that built that townhouse essentially blacklisted so he could never build anything again. Like all of those people live in those kinds of houses. Like none of them actually live in a concrete box. The moment they have enough money to move into like some old 18th or 19th century townhouse, all of them do. Like none of them live in concrete boxes. And so again, like this sort of hypocrisy, it can only really manifest as sadism. Like it would be one thing if, I really like concrete boxes, and there are some really weird people out there who don't want to live in one. But I mean, there are people who live in dog houses or whatever. Like it's their business. They may be crazy, but whatever. I don't care. Like again, if that was the dynamic, like nobody would care. If not living in a concrete box was on the level of living in a tree house that your 10-year-old son had built for you, or like a dog house or something, like nobody gets mad over that. Like people who do that, they're just crazy. But again, the anger here sort of comes from like, why are you not as complicit in this as I am?
Yeah, the fact that you won't agree
Yeah.
that you won't become complicit, becomes a reproach to the other person. They react
Yeah.
violently.
Yeah, a friend of mine doesn't have a smartphone. And so when he picks up like his ancient sort of 90s era mobile phone to answer a call or whatever, the moment someone sees that, they just get incredibly sort of, I want to use the word triggered here. But like, so when he puts it down, they just go, "Why don't you have a smartphone?" And he just says, "No, look, I don't think all of these screens and, like social media, I don't think that's very healthy. So I just made a choice to not have a smartphone." And everyone then just goes, "No, but you can't do that. Like, you're not allowed to." And it's like,
We're
sorry,
all
is
doing
there,
it. You have to
yeah,
do it too.
yeah. And he just goes like, because he likes sort of playing with people. He just goes, "So is there a law that says I can't buy one of these old phones?" And the more he sort of just plays stupid, the more frustrated like the interlocutor becomes, like the more sort of openly angry they become. Because again, a lot of this is just, I wish I had the strength to do the same. But what would my family say? What would my boss say? No, I have to have this. I have to have social media. I have to have this smartphone. I have to be available at all times. Like, I can't make the choice that you've done, and that frustrates me.
Yeah, I mean, the sadism that you describe is interesting. I mean, this is another one of these elements that's probably under thought about and under discussed, but it's a very real element. I'm not sure what else to say about that, but because both of you have talked about it, Amy's talked about it a bit, but it's I don't know, that it just feels like somebody needs to, I don't know, write something about it, have it think about it a bit. It's related intimately to the attack on beauty. I did an episode maybe a month ago with Roger Kimball, and we talked about sort of ideas of beauty and art and these sorts of things. If you know Roger or know his work, this is a place he spent a lot of his career. And most, but just given my audience, most people really enjoyed the episode. But there was definitely a group of people who caught wind of this and were convinced that sort of the celebration of ideals in art was, that way lies Dachau, and it just that's very hard for me to wrap my mind around.
Yeah, I mean that is at least the ideological reason that they give. I mean that idea, if you talk to people in the world of art, they will say that yeah, that's absolutely commonplace. So the idea of that beauty, that only somebody like Roger Scruton would defend such a thing. That you either have to be just a total reactionary or an actual fascist to see the value of beauty. But then it's like the rioters and that section of the left, they are the sadists. They are the ones who enjoy forcing you to see ugly things, and to provoke you with that. But then the class that they're really serving, look at where they live. I mean, like Malcolm was saying, if you go to the most beautiful, architecturally and naturally beautiful parts of any country, you'll see that the property values are extremely high. So they want to be surrounded by natural and man-made beauty all the time, but they will also they will also not allow kind of ordinary people to have access to those things. I mean, one of the reasons I love trains so much is that, and particularly I think I love trains, and I think that they should be very affordable, is that it allows, ideally depending on how they're designed, but at least in Ireland it allows like everyone to be able to see the countryside,
Right.
And stuff like that. I think those things have enormous value. And I also think that, I mean, I don't want to idealize the old elites too much, but it's very striking when you go around like museums and things like that, and you see like a whole wing is like bequeathed to the people of the city by some heiress or former industrialist or something like that. And I was just thinking this the other day because I was in such an exhibition. It was actually a furniture one. And I was thinking, yeah, I mean, as I say, I won't idealize these people. They got Pinkertons to kill their workers and stuff like that. So, but they were a mix of those two things. But now there's kind of nothing like that. There's no part of the elite that has a sense that it would be a high prestige thing to want to conserve a beautiful part of the countryside or leave behind, beautiful works of art for the people, stuff like that they used to think. And now it's just, it really is just uglification kind of at every level of the elite. And also, if you look at their consumption habits, if you go into more expensive stores, you will always see there's a very trad kind of element to the stuff that they buy, right? So it will be like bread that's made out of some unprocessed grain, which has got like a picture of a peasant on the front or something like that. And, and even like, the whole aesthetic of Etsy and stuff like that. It's weird how they have this strangely nostalgic or traditionalist kind of aesthetic in their own consumption habits. But if anyone talks about those things directly, they will say that's fascist.
Yeah, when elites are functioning well, it's certainly fair game to criticize what they do wrong, but it's also right to figure out what they're doing that's good for people. But when they're functioning well, they're transmitters of high culture and of what underlies society. And so they become patrons of the arts. They leave things like art or just open land, sort of nature preserves, because the idea is that they're ennobling, that they uplift people. And now there's a different version of that in the elites where they think it is incumbent upon them, to use your term, to sort of uglify things and to tear people
manage down expectations, essentially, to just get people used to the fact that, no, you should live in this like container hotel and just drink the bug milk or whatever, because you don't deserve anything more. And we can't afford to sort of like have you actually enjoy anything like good in life, because our social democratic project, or socialism for millennials and for Silicon Valley, like, I'm sorry, all the resources are already spoken for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want one last thing, and then we've gone really long, so maybe we should start to sort of wrap up. But one thing I've noticed in the States, it sounds like it's the same in Sweden, it's probably the same throughout the West. But if you look at neighborhoods that have very expensive residential real estate, and I think it's actually most pronounced if you look at the most expensive vacation type communities, like a place like Aspen, Colorado. They, first of all, they're lovely. So they're typically set in really beautiful natural surroundings. But what you see is almost like an idealized version of sort of a mid 20th century middle class.
Yeah.
And I was in Aspen last summer, and I noticed, the real estate prices there are unbelievably insane. There was a house, just sort of a 2-story clapboard, sort of neo-Victorian type house in town on a, relatively small piece of property. And there's a man outside who was mowing the lawn. It was totally obvious that it was his house, just the way he was dressed and the watch he was wearing, as that sort of thing. And so here's this guy out there, just enjoying mowing his lawn under the shade trees and having, a few moments of peace to himself. And I'm thinking, there's no way that this guy isn't hedge fund manager or something, right? Because this house, even though it looks very modest, if you took a picture of it, you'd think, the house is, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 square feet, which is not small, but it's not a mansion of the type that the 20th or 19th century industrialists built. I thought this house has to be $10 million.
Yeah.
Right. Given where it is. And so I went on Zillow because I wanted to know how much it was. And the house was, according to Zillow, was worth like basically $10 million. And here's this guy out there basically paying an enormous amount of money for this house just so that he could effectively live what we think of as a middle class life.
Yeah.
And that's when I sort of had this epiphany that one of the fundamental and disturbing realities is that what we think of as middle-class normalcy in America is we've gotten to the point where that's actually a luxury good.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to that? Like in Sweden, you have the same sort of dynamic, but here it's added, like you can add immigration to that, essentially. So everyone on the left just says, no, dude, we have to essentially grow the country. Like at some point, the meme was that Sweden should have like 30 million inhabitants. So, like, Swedish people in that situation would be like 8 million, and then the rest would be refugees from various parts of the world, essentially. But given what's happening is that you have all of these sort of ethnic enclaves with a lot of problems and so on forming. Like Sweden isn't one society today. It's like several different societies with very little contact with each other that are just awkwardly glued together. And so one of the sort of things that you pay for under the table, like unofficially, to move into those neighborhoods is just, to have neighbors that you can actually talk to, like that
Right.
you
That's
can
right.
even speak the same language.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't about race, by the way. It's not like I don't want to live in a neighborhood with a lot of black people because, racial supremacy. No, it's not that at all. Like nobody belonging to this upper middle class minds having some Iranian sort of dentist or whatever. They find that to be like really great actually, because maybe some of the study habits of that Iranian dentist kids will rub off on their kids essentially. But and people have just said this to me like openly that I want more of these like really hardworking immigrants to live in my neighborhood so that sort of academic achievements move up even more. It's just that like for everyone else, what you're getting is this sort of like growing ethnic conflict. Like nobody speaks the same language, but that doesn't matter because all of these people are meant to, I don't know, mow lawns or do landscaping or something. Like the servants, they don't need to even be able to speak with each other. But like the masters, they really want to live in an area that was like 100% of Sweden like 60 years ago, where sure, you share the same culture and the same language and the same sort of frame of reference with your neighbors. But that is becoming a luxury. So
I saw an article in the New York Times which was all about where are you going to go now that you're leaving New York? And the picture was this really quaint little town, where people live in the townhouses and stuff like that. I don't know where it was, and I just thought, God, I really hate our elites so much. Like, they made these riots happen. They ruined these cities, and now they're all going to swan off to these like quaint little traditional looking village type of things where
And
they
ruin
will
them.
be where they will be totally isolated, or they will be totally protected from the consequences of what they do. I wish there was a way to just, all these like children of the elite going on about, not wanting the police or, defunding the police and so on. The only reason that they have been allowed to go and gentrify these cities is because there's police everywhere, like basically overseeing the project. And so I wish there was a way to force them to live with the consequences of what they're doing. And that's the real killer. That's the bit that really enrages me, is that they never have to do that. The people they're attacking are the ones that will have to live with the consequences of it.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So the mayor of Portland, Ted Wheeler, or maybe it was 3, 4, 5 days ago, the Antifa protesters found out the apartment building that he lives in, and went and set fire to it, and because obviously it was put out, but it was announced a day or two later that he was moving. I thought,
Yeah.
well, it's great because guess what? He can move, but maybe not everybody can do that when their neighborhood has been burned down. I mean, you look at the cities and the neighborhoods that have had these really bad riots in the United States in the past, starting in the 60s. They don't ever really recover,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
it not I'm sure somebody will be listening to me and say, aha, well, no, by this measure, they did recover 50 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah. A, I'm not even sure that those measurements are right. And B, it took 50 years, right? That's most of somebody's life.
Mm.
So, well, look, it's you've been super generous with your time, but this has been fantastic. I don't want to take up, I do want to take up your whole day, but I'll be polite and I won't. But look, Malcolm and Angela, thank you. I hope that you'll both come back and we can pick up on some of these threads because these are things that, I don't know, I find them extremely interesting and they try to help explain what's going on around us. So I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.